Bove. I teach in the ACS program, and in particular in the Politics and Freedom Learning Community, which is one of the sponsors of today's event. The other is the Matthew J. Ryan Center, which is the primary sponsor for the event. So on behalf of both organizations, I welcome all of you and wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day, one of the great American holidays that we have. I'd like to introduce Professor William Allen, tell you a few things about him. I'll try to be brief, although he has a very extensive resume and record we could talk about. Professor Allen is professor at Michigan State University, where he's had a long and distinguished career, and before that was professor of government at Harvey Mudd College, one of the Claremont colleges in California. He's done other things besides teach. He was, for a time, I believe in the late 80s, if I'm not incorrect, chairman of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He was recently the Ann and Herbert Vaughn Visiting Fellow in the James Madison program at Princeton University. And even more recently, we were privileged to have him as a visitor here at Villanova just last year as a senior scholar in the Matthew J. Ryan Center. And I would just say, sort of based on my own personal experience, that Professor Allen has been really a major influence on a lot of people here, students and faculty alike. And he's taught here, but he's also been very active in all kinds of informal activities, reading groups and so forth. Come on in, everybody. Find a seat if you can. So I just wanted to point that out, that he's really gone beyond the call of duty. He's come up to Villanova from his home in Maryland frequently to be with us, and we've all learned a great deal from him. Just a word about Professor Allen's scholarship, which ranges very widely through political philosophy and American politics. He's taught many different courses in both fields and has published prolifically in both fields. I won't attempt to list his many publications, but I did discover that he has a very fine website, so you can all go there and browse through those if you'd like. I would, however, like to mention two recent books which he's published, one on George Washington, both of which I own, and another entitled Rethinking Uncle Tom, The Political Philosophy of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I mention these in particular because I think they show something distinctive about Professor Allen and one of his, what I find to be one of his real strengths, and that is the following. To uncover, or perhaps to recover, the wisdom and the enduring vitality of American thinkers, authors, statesmen, and indeed literary characters whose greatness the prevailing intellectual culture has perhaps sometimes failed to recognize or has sometimes even sought to obscure. George Washington, I think, is one such figure, and so I hope you will welcome Dr. Allen, who's going to talk to us today about George Washington's statecraft.
Thank you. I can take one thing for certain. The Villanova is not playing today. It's really great to be back here again and to chat with you about what is one of my favorite topics, which is George Washington. The fact that there's a long list of such topics does not at all diminish the fact that I really regard Washington as the touchstone of my scholarly thinking and research over the course of, by now, many decades. I'm going to speak today specifically from the text, George Washington, America's First Progressive, and the 8th chapter, George Washington, Statesman, in order to try to bring home to you some sense of what George Washington's statecraft consisted in. I am aware that that leaves many things undiscussed, details and incidents of Washington's life and character, which are often of great interest to people, and I therefore do not intend to speak for the entire time we are together in monologue fashion, but to leave ample time for conversation. So if you have any favorite Washington question you want to pose, I hope you will certainly feel free to do so at that point. But I'm going to focus like a laser, as they love to say in Washington, D.C. these days, on the topic of Washington's statecraft, because I believe it's important for us to come to understand what statesmanship itself is and the ways in which it makes a difference in the lives of peoples in various communities. And so let us start by simply posing the question, what is statesmanship? That is not often always intuitive. Human beings have a marvelous susceptibility to the ambition to take command. And we sometimes mistake the ideal of statesmanship as a mere giving of commands that are obeyed. That certainly was not Washington's approach, though. As a commander, he had oft occasion to give commands. But statesmanship would be more properly and fully comprehended as essentially the art of instruction and inducement. I say instruction and inducement. Putting instruction first for the sufficient reason that a statesman's goal is no more nearly realized than in the task of imparting to communities the wherewithal and the wherefores for essential human conduct. The statesman is concerned with who we are and how we are. And therefore, the statesman must undertake instruction in order that we attain that posture of fulfillment that is possible for us as human beings within particular communities. So we begin by observing a simple fact, namely, we can't become fully human apart from community. The life of politics is not a life of expediency. It's a life of necessity. What is at stake is the very possibility of being a human being in the fullest sense in which it is possible to be a human being. Aristotle stated it most plainly, of course, when he observed that man outside of the polis is either a beast or a god. Certainly not a man, not a human being. So that we understand the political community to exist not as a happenstance of history or accident of circumstance, if you prefer, but rather as a necessity of nature. That means, therefore, that insofar as political community has to be constructed, instituted, or founded, it requires that this natural function be attained through specific arts of formation, specific arts of instruction and direction. Now, you may think I'm turning political office into a classroom performance, turning statesmen into teachers, masters, tutors. And so I am. After all, what else is instruction? What else is a statesman to undertake other than to impart to fellows sufficient reason to undertake the conduct of political life, and to do it with a sensible awareness, consciousness of the degrees of obligation that are involved. So to define it as instruction means precisely to understand that every political community is a laboratory of learning. That insofar as it does not attain that height, it fails as political community. I say also inducement because, as we all know, or should know, it is insufficient simply to learn. One must also will to perform in accord with what is learned. While there are theories that the mere learning itself results in virtuous conduct, the reality of experience is that we do not often observe that following. It takes something more in addition to the learning. There is a slight connection between learning and willing that has to be achieved through what I will speak loosely now and call inducement. That is where we discover within ourselves a will to perform the specific task that we have learned to be necessary, or appreciating the necessary not abstractly but as moral urgency. So inducement has to do with imparting moral urgency to the lessons that flow from instruction. That is the task of the statesman. We're not now speaking about the crafty politician who manages through clever ruse to induce us to come to some kind of public resolution, half aware of what it is we've resolved to undertake. We're not talking about those legislative arts of working into law by hook or by crook, whatever particular interested party's agenda is on the table, without regard to carrying with the accomplishment of the agenda a full comprehension of what is entailed. Those are arts that we all experience and witness daily. You might say we see them unfolding before us even at this moment. But those are not arts of statesmanship. Those are arts of a kind of craft, to be sure, not to say a kind of craftiness. But they're not arts of statesmanship. For statesmanship recognizes at the outset that there is no political accomplishment which is worthy that doesn't transform in a fundamental way the souls of the community members who are engaged in the accomplishment. Alexander the Great learned that, according to Montesquieu. He learned that when he wished to be worshipped as a god, and therefore commanded his captains and others about him so to regard him, only to discover that they could not bring themselves to sacrifice their consciences to mere command. The frustration he experienced at that moment revealed that even in the great conqueror himself, there was some deficiency of statesmanship, for he could not induce them to do what they could not experience as morally urgent within themselves. So let us take this criterion of moral urgency as fundamentally necessary to complete any significant political accomplishment. Let me illustrate this with current news, just so that we can get into George Washington with full preparation for what it is I want to bring before you. You have heard, perhaps if you've read your newspapers, as I'm sure you all have done, that there was recently a moment in the state of Israel in which the relationships between the United States and Israel were seen to be tenuous because of what was experienced as a snub to our vice president. The great snub in which some representatives of the state of Israel or municipalities in the state of Israel announced the establishment of 1,600 new homes or settlements in East Jerusalem at the very moment that the vice president was there seeking to build bridges for peace, and therefore speaking in a most circumspect manner about the conduct of the respective parties, Israel and Palestine. That moment of snub has produced a great hiccup in the relationships between the United States and Israel. It has been said that this is an affront, and this has been stated officially by representatives of the United States, that even if they wanted to do it, they ought to have had the decency not to announce it while the vice president was there, and thus to underscore how little leverage has the United States over policy in Israel. And as the debates that have ensued since then, and they have been nonstop, the focus has been entirely on the question of whether Israel misplayed its hand. Now, if you were looking at this from the perspective of statesmanship, you would have to look not just at what Israel did, but what also the United States did. And you would have to try to penetrate unspoken veils of communication that would explain how such a thing could occur. It is perfectly obvious that the primary mission of the vice president in Israel was not to further, through his sole efforts, the peace process, whatever may have been said ostensibly, but to deliver privately, what cannot be stated publicly, a stern message about what the United States could tolerate from Israel with respect to the nuclear threat in Iran. This is something that is regarded of the highest importance in the United States. And it is thought that unless a clear message is conveyed that will restrain Israel, the United States will find itself in the compromised position of having to react to a potential military strike from Israel. And this is something, above all, which the American administration does not wish to see, and which it's willing to bring grave pressure to bear upon Israel in order to forestall. Now, once you bear that in mind and you ask again, what really transpired in the Israeli announcement of the building of these new settlements? Was it an attempt to undercut the peace talks, or was it an attempt to communicate publicly a response to communications that can only be made privately? An attempt to inform the United States just how much leverage it actually has over Israeli decision-making in a way that would begin to try to shake loose the firm posture that the United States administration has assumed with regard to the Iranian threat. Now you say, well, is that not a speculation? And I respond, of course it is. But the point is this. Statesmanship requires seeing through to the hearts of things beyond what lies upon the surface. Appropriate instruction and inducement requires leaving nothing unexplored that might serve the purpose of understanding as well as accomplishing important political objectives. When you weigh the relative significance of the events transpiring in the situation, you cannot fail to observe that what really matters most today for Israel and for the United States is to come to some clarity about what the decision-making process will be regarding Iran and its nuclear capabilities. No statesman could enter into this relationship in this moment without taking into account whatever was done in terms of its effect on that question. And since that is impossible, it is doubtless likely and perhaps certain that what transpired had more to do with that great existential threat than with the expediential condition of ongoing peace talks. And if that's true, then you must also conclude what you have just witnessed is an act of statesmanship in the state of Israel, which served its purpose of communicating to the United States just how much they can command Israel to perform. They now know, and you can measure the depth of their knowledge by the anxiety they are publicly expressing about the relationship. Here's a case in which, let us say, Mr. Netanyahu has engaged in some instruction and at the same time offered some inducement to alter behavior. So this is the kind of example I'm talking about. Now let's see if we can apply an understanding of that subtlety of understanding and analysis to George Washington and the founding of the United States. I will begin with an observation about something Washington said that it perhaps poses the greatest challenge of his entire statesmanship. It occurred in 1783. It was towards the close of the circular address to the governors of the 13 states. This is an address which Washington himself named his political legacy. As he was preparing to retire as Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United States following the conclusion of the war with only the signing of peace treaties still pending, he distributed what has to be taken as a political platform, but not political in the narrow or ordinary sense. It was a platform to guide the further founding of the country. As he put it, to cement the Union and to build a national character. So it had the highest possible ambition. That address, in which he frankly declares a project of making citizens out of this disparate lot, closes with an invitation extended to his fellow citizens to perform an imitatio Christi. He said, let us imitate the divine author of our humble religion. This invitation to the imitatio Christi is, of course, not something new in the world, nor is it a thing of small consequence. There are enormous implications, whether one takes as one's guide Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, or the long tradition of discussion of the Imitatio Christi. Whether one sees the Imitatio Christi as the essential foundation of learning, as many intelligently do, or whether one sees it as a mere moral encouragement. One must see that it is itself part of a profound tradition of moral analysis and understanding, and that it would be posed to a community as the grounds for forming the self-understanding of that community and the national character which he said he was building at that very moment. One has to see that he's proclaiming an intention to engage in the profoundest kind of instruction. And what remains is to discern what possible inducements could lead to the accomplishment of that end, even if the goal were fully learned and properly appreciated. His statesmanship then would have to be directed, you see, to creating this community in which the Imitatio Christi could become real and not merely an abstract proposition or a vague moral encouragement. So now we're not talking about the extent to which he could influence this or that important politician to approve this or that political resolution or legislative agenda. We're speaking on the much grander scale of the extent to which it is possible for him to create within the entire community a focused attention on the project of shaping the community into a certain kind of people with certain beliefs and practices and with full and humble deference to a moral horizon made explicit and not left indeterminate. Now, we could speak at great length about the importance of understanding communities as being dependent upon having defined rather than indeterminate moral horizons. At length, partly because we all know we live in an age in which the prevailing orthodoxy holds that moral indeterminacy is the only ground of community. That's the way I put it. You've heard it said other ways. All things are relative. Who's to judge? It goes on and on and on. We pretend in the hour in which we live that indeterminacy of ends is the only condition of peace in any community. Sometimes it's called diversity. It's called any number of things. But Washington stood on the ground that only determinate ends, clearly articulated and fully inculcated, can constitute the grounds of political community, or at least viable political community. And the specific form that Washington envisioned was that we understand as the Imitatio Christi. Well, to get to the bottom of that requires us to be able to see in Washington's specific acts and counsel exactly how it is he accomplished it. And in chapter 8 of George Washington, America's First Progressive, what I've done is to recount primarily the farewell address and Washington's attempt in that farewell address to summarize his statecraft. That's the best way to understand it. He comes before the country in the 11th hour of his service to the country and sets forth his valedictory address, in which he states with clarity what he has done, what the country has done, and what its future holds. In stating what he has done, Washington is laying out for us his statecraft and demonstrating the ways in which we may not only understand it as history, but enter into it as future prospect. Now, I can't, of course, simply read the entire chapter to you, but I am going to read some passages for you and try to establish context as well as specific references that Washington is making. But I begin by putting it in a general context in order that we can appreciate what it means to shape a political community in the first place. So let me read the opening paragraph. We are good, they are evil. The sense of this statement is misleading, innocent of all regard for circumstance. It cannot possibly be true in the sense intended by the post-World War II moralists who discovered collective responsibility. Nor can it be true in the sense of those who ascribe moral character to a whole people as opposed to individuals. Nor again can it be merely relatively true in the sense that the statement is true for all and hence only nominally exclusive. Nonetheless, the burden of this chapter is to show just how it can be true. What hinges on that proof is the proper understanding of a just security policy in a Republican regime. So, at the outset, what I declare is that I'm going to explain what Washington thought to be a just security policy for a Republican regime, and that explanation requires us to learn what it means to speak of our own polity, our own country, our own society as good, and any, if not all others, as evil, and why that does not amount to moral reductionism or moral imperialism. Now, in the course of demonstrating that, naturally in the chapter, I have to work my way through some preliminary considerations which are not germane here this afternoon, including a review of the work of Thucydides, who, as political historian, paves the way for the kind of work that George Washington undertook, at least in teaching us what is required of statesmen. Then I come to terms fairly quickly with the presentation in the Federalist Papers, which, among other things, also discuss the conditions for national security and how those intertwine with the provisions for making the extended republic safe for human freedom, so that we get a yin and yang, thinking of Sun Tzu, or whatever patterning you wish to use for this. You get the paired relationship, I'll put it that way, of the terms of national existence, such that what occurs within, or domestically as we all want to say, and what affects us from without must all be determined on the grounds of identical principles. That's the underlying point, without having to work our way all the way through the argument. Nothing that is not good for the character of the nation as nation can serve the nation's purpose from the point of its security, and vice versa. Nothing can serve the nation's security that cannot also serve its existence as a distinct political entity, a distinct polity. So with those observations accomplished, I am then free to turn to Washington's statesmanship. And it's a statesmanship which I have labeled under the subtitle, "And Justice for All," which is to say that the end of it is for Washington to declare that a condition for successful foreign policy in a republic such as the United States is to be uniformly just in its dealings, not because of the moralistic criterion of humanity or a predetermination to treat all peoples everywhere according to a moral standard derived externally or exiguously, but rather because that uniform justice is the only condition for sustaining a healthy public opinion, which ultimately must govern the United States. So that Washington is able to derive from the necessity of governing by public opinion in the United States the necessity of acting justly in the world. And we can explain that fairly quickly also. Washington is aware of the multiple possibilities of statecraft. But he's also aware of the specific necessities of the Republican regime or constitution. He's aware of Machiavellian councils. He knows the history of princes who play fast and loose with the truth, who play casually with questions of justice and injustice when it comes to acting from the point of view of self-defense or national self-defense. He's rejecting all those possibilities not because they don't work for certain kinds of states. They may very well. He's rejecting them because it is clear that a regime governed by a consistent or stable public opinion cannot move in the world with the flexibility of a lone prince. A lone prince can change his mind, can break covenants. A whole people cannot do that so readily. If public opinion must be stable and fixed, it cannot be treated as something fickle and insubstantial. And the only way to sustain stable and fixed opinion is to tie it to a specific objective which can be plainly adhered to. And that objective is justice in all dealings. That was Washington's counsel through the course of the farewell address, and that was, as he himself argued, the path he followed throughout the founding. Now, it's perfectly reasonable to entertain the question whether Washington did not pursue consistent justice because Washington placed the priority on justice itself, rather than looking at it instrumentally as a requirement to sustain a Republican polity. But don't forget, he's interested not in just any old state or regime, but a specific form of state or regime, which he understands to be that which fulfills human nature, that which is best for human beings. So if he puts the best first, it is not necessary to ask him to put justice first, or virtue first, or any other specific form of goodness first, for those will all descend from having put the human best as first in terms of priority. Now, in the farewell address, how does he accomplish this? That becomes the question, right? This is his objective. We know he has oriented us towards the imitatio Christi. We might think that that is what defines what is best for human beings per se, but how, in the farewell address, does he give an account for the accomplishment of this? Let me just read a couple of paragraphs, and then I will summarize what follows. Understanding why we are good and they are evil relieves the recognition of the rule of necessity from the charge of Machiavellianism. I have previously explained with reference to Thucydides what the rule of necessity is. I summarize it to you by saying every state exists in the world under something we can call the rule of necessity, which is you have to act in self-defense. That is a bastardization, but it works. America, however, offers only one full and fully conscientious response to the charge of Machiavellianism, Washington's farewell address. It requires patient analysis to discover the response, which is proved by the fact that the farewell itself has not infrequently been charged with Machiavellianism. The first person to make the charge was Pierre Adet, the French ambassador to the United States in 1796 when the address was delivered. Washington, on the other hand, understood himself to have defended principles of justice and humanity. Those are his terms used in the address, justice and humanity. It would be worthwhile to consider the case of this disparity in detail. So what happens then in the chapter is that I provide precisely that detail. And I remind us, as I enter into the detail, what Washington said in the first inaugural address. Washington's first inaugural address, setting forth the ends of the government, made perhaps the most puzzling remark of his career. Referring to the great assemblage of communities and interests represented in the institution of the government, he discerned a pledge that, quote, the foundations of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, and the preeminence of a free government be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affection of its citizens and command the respect of the world. I suppose that's not a bad definition of American exceptionalism, is it? But of course, at the heart of it is this observation of private morality, which must strike our ears orthogonally at the outset, since we would think, if we're talking about building a community and having a moral horizon which is uniformly understood and adhered to, that we're talking about public morality. But no, Washington is talking about private morality. What does imitatio Christi imply? Not that we see ourselves through collective vision, but we see ourselves through the eyes of individual responsibility, individual response to the moral command, that we accept the idea of self-government, first and foremost, as an individual obligation, not something procedural, not a question of majority rule, not a question of democratic process, but a question of moral self-restraint, self-government in that form. A community of self-governing people will be a community that imitates Christ. That's Washington's understanding. That means each must do it in turn, privately, in order for its public benefits to become manifest. So it is private morality, which is the first condition of national happiness in Washington's account. He said that in the first inaugural address. So now as he returns to the formulation in the farewell address, it gives us the opportunity to see that what he's talking about is creating a national morality that has the full force of private morality. In the same address, the first inaugural, Washington described the hand of God as that invisible hand which authors every public and private good. So you see, in that era, Adam Smith wasn't the only person to speak of an invisible hand. To merit the propitious smiles of the invisible hand, however, the nation must show regard for the rules of order and right. These rules establish a strict relationship, in his words, in the economy and course of nature, between virtue and happiness, or duty and advantage, and between the genuine maxim of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity. So this that he laid out at the outset of his presidential administration is then what is summarized in the farewell address at the end of his presidential administration. Now, the farewell address is constructed most artfully, and before I describe that artful construction, let me simply dispense for the moment with scholarly obfuscation. You will hear it said frequently that Washington did not write the farewell address, Alexander Hamilton did. It is true. Alexander Hamilton was his ghost writer, if you want to think of it in those terms that we use today. However, the process by which this ghost writing is accomplished is something nothing less than extraordinary. In April, Washington writes to Hamilton, who's in New York. Washington's still at the Capitol. And he sends him a letter asking him to draft a farewell address, but the letter carries with it a set of extracts, including the very brief address that James Madison had drafted upon being asked in 1792. So he creates this packet of materials, sends them to Hamilton, and then he adds an outline of the points he wants to make. And he says, sit down and write it out, draft it up. And then between April and September, when it's finally ready, they are writing back and forth constantly. Hamilton sending drafts, Washington returning it for changes and corrections and asking for things to be inserted that are admitted or things to be reordered in their exposition. In short, what you had was a sustained interaction between Washington and Hamilton on the farewell address, with Washington providing guidance every step of the way for what was to be said and even how it was to be said. So that we have no reason to diminish Washington's authorial responsibility for the farewell address, just as with so many other things in the course of his life. And it's easy, in fact, in my the book that I published, George Washington, the Collection, which is a collection of his writings, you can easily figure this out for yourself by going back and observing how often passages appear in his public papers that previously appeared in his correspondence. That he would take this material, give it to ghostwriters, and they would enter it into the public addresses. But he had actually authored it in the first place. So there's no reason to suspect that Washington was not the author of the farewell address. So what about the farewell address? Well, it consists essentially of 52 paragraphs. And it is ordered in very strict fashion. There are 25 ascending paragraphs as I described them, and then a 26, and then the rest descending paragraphs. The 25 ascending paragraphs describe Washington's contributions to the founding, all his efforts, all that he labored to do, all that he labored to communicate from the war through the administration of the government, and this parallels the growth in the government stability and structure. Then for the descending paragraphs, they're descending only in the sense that Washington recedes. He speaks of himself far less often, almost not at all. So the first half, Washington speaks of what Washington has done. Second half, Washington speaks of what the people are doing. Very important. The organization means to show the process through which the people come to be cognizant of being one people. Actually, he doesn't say cognizant, he says they come to love being one people. So he's describing the statesmanship by which they're led step by step to embrace the ideal that has been set before them, and then showing how it is they will proceed thenceforth to adhere to that ideal. Now, in the course of this, Washington gives what we would consider heuristic advice. He says such things as, avoid inveterate party attachments. That's not healthy in a free Republican regime. That leads to strife and division. He explains, don't try to live without religion. The idea of a republic without religion is oxymoronic. And he goes on with all those specific kinds of advice that are included in the farewell. He specifically gives advice about the conduct of foreign policy. He says we should have neither permanent friends nor enemies in the international sphere, i.e., we shouldn't set the course of our national policy by pretended affection or disaffection for other states. We should rather guide ourselves by that justice and humanity, which is the sure course of a sane security policy for the United States. Now, in all of this, Washington is not simply giving advice. He's also summarizing how he has conducted himself throughout the course of the development of the United States as a new country. Example, when it was proposed in 1777 that the United States enter into a formal alliance with the French, which eventually we did. But the initial proposal came earlier than it was, we might say, militarily required, and in terms which Washington wrote back and explained would expose the United States to subjection and dependence on the French, and that we had to be wary of making ourselves so completely subject to the influence of a powerful state in our affairs that afterwards we would not be able to recover our independence from it. In which, of course, he is really echoing Machiavelli. Those who have read The Prince have seen it said, of course, that a weak state that allies itself with a powerful state will subject itself to that powerful state. So that one must be careful about those things. It was therefore no surprise when 1791 through 93, the question of revolutionary France's military adventurism arose to raise the question of American adherence to the Franco-American Treaty of Alliance, that Washington pondered and decided to declare a proclamation of neutrality and not to go to war on the basis of that treaty for the sake of France. I.e., Washington's decision was that yes, we had a treaty, but the treaty was not a suicide pact, and we didn't have to honor that treaty. France itself was the source of these wars. It was not acting defensively but aggressively, and therefore it would be unrealistic for the United States to undertake treaty obligations in that circumstance. Washington took the heat. He had to force the decision against the inclinations of his Secretary of State at the time. And there was, of course, an exhaustive public controversy over whether he was abusing the offices of president by taking this single-handed, unique posture in America's world situation, and even creating the impression of ingratitude for those who had been of assistance to the United States in acquiring her liberty in the first place. Washington nevertheless defends each of these acts precisely in the manner that you see outlined in the farewell address. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, the consistent pursuit of justice. Why does he do it? He does it, he says, because this is the only way to continue to build and sustain the authority of public opinion in the United States. See, Washington was consistently engaged in trying to prove the practicability of governing a people through public opinion. Now, in doing this and laying out the criteria for doing so in the farewell address, Washington is building upon an important element which explains why I defined statesmanship in the manner that I did at the outset. The goal is to show that the excellence of free government stems from immunity to principles of command. So if you ask, why do you define statesmanship as instruction and inducement and nowhere mention command? Don't we typically think of statesmen as commanders, as issuing orders that people have to obey, and of course in backing those orders up with firm force? The answer Washington gives is no. Statesmanship does not have to do command. In fact, have to do with command. In fact, you might conclude that anyone who has to resort to command fails as a statesman. Take that as a foregone conclusion, as axiomatic. Whoever governs by command does not act as a statesman. There's a perfect example of this in the statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln, by the way, not only throughout his career, but in some of the specific events of that career. Lincoln had to fight off his friends who wanted him to assume a posture of command. Order the slaves freed. Order this, order that, put a stop to it. And Lincoln kept insisting, I have to do everything I do from the perspective of adhering to the law and to ruling to the fullest extent possible through the instrumentalities of Republican government. And yes, it was Lincoln who made the statement that he was not going to sit quibbling about the Constitution while the Union was being destroyed. But he never meant by that he would not adhere to the Constitution. He meant, for example, in the case of dealing with the question of suspending the writ of habeas corpus, that it needed to be done to save the Union when he did it. He would abide by any subsequent decision about whether his act was constitutional or not, since the Constitution didn't identify who could suspend the writ. And it might reasonably be argued that only Congress could do so, only an act of Congress sent to the president could do so. He would be willing to allow that to be determined through regular procedures, but subsequently, because right now in the emergency we needed to suspend the writ. Well, it was that attitude of being subordinate to law and the instrumentalities of instruction and inducement as opposed to command that Washington was counseling. And as we read through the farewell address, we see then that Washington is concerned to always sustain the link between what we might call the public good and private morality, i.e., the public good is the reward of private morality. Why can you not use command to accomplish that public good? Well, think about it for a moment. If private morality means mainly self-government, what does it mean if you can only deal with people by command? It means self-government isn't working. If they're only doing what they're ordered to do and not what the order of their souls lead them to do, then of course it's not working. So the public good only emerges when the private morality is generally operative, only when self-government prevails. That is why command is ruled out of the question as an instrumentality of statecraft in a proper regime or constitution. So in the course of looking at these arguments, we can see that George Washington is exceedingly conscious as he leaves office that he's leaving the nation, the polity, not in the hands of his successors in office, but in the hands of the people. His statecraft was designed to make that possible. His statesmanship was predicated on the necessity of doing just that. How emphatic was he about it? Well, in 1798, after the successor administration of John Adams had run into a number of difficulties and the Federalist Party, political party, was beginning to lose traction, and the important figures still operating in politics and in the Federalist Party were beginning to despair about the looming election of 1800. One of those figures, Jonathan Trumbull of Connecticut, writes a letter to George Washington, asking George Washington to come back. He says, we're at a complete loss. We don't know what we're going to do. We need you to come and stand for us again. And Washington responded to Trumbull with the observation, look, if the principles won't do it for you, you might as well put up a broomstick. It doesn't matter because it's not worth it if it depends on personalities, whether you can win an election or sustain the government. So that's how emphatically he understood that the instrumentalities of political life being generated had to be turned over once and for all to the hands of the people, and not to be dependent on charismatic figures, not to be dependent on momentary agendas or political platforms even. Because when he referred to principles, he really meant the principles of republicanism, not the declared platform of a political party. Thus, what the farewell address is about is precisely the character of statesmanship that's necessary in a free republic. That's what George Washington is doing. Well, isn't that instruction on a grand scale? Think how long after we've continued to hear attributed to George Washington the phrase, no entangling alliances. Now that's of course rather Thomas Jefferson's phrase than George Washington's. George Washington said no permanent friendships, no permanent enmities. But Jefferson's phrase was just an application of Washington's teaching. And Jefferson's rather more concise expression of it continued that teaching down to the present day for all practical purposes, because we still hear it adverted to. It is true, as Professor Beauvais said in the introduction, that we fell into a period in which George Washington was belittled, if not altogether discounted. His name removed from public school buildings, scholarship, revisionist scholarship, discounting his ability, his intellectual ability, his understanding, and depreciating his contribution to the founding in comparison with that of other founders like Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. Nevertheless, it remains the case that we continue to operate in the terms that Washington so patiently laid down. I'll illustrate once more what this instruction and inducement means in terms of statecraft. Return to the early days of his presidential administration and observe that he created a cabinet not based on partisan adherence, but based on the talents of the cabinet officers. He managed differences among them. Now, even with that cabinet broke up. There emerged divisions that could not be reconciled, and these strong personalities ended up going in differing directions in terms of their partisan commitments. Most notably, of course, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Pardon me, not James Madison, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. But the point, of course, is that through the course of his administration, and whoever were the cabinet members, Washington still managed them, and he managed them in a very special way. He trusted them to carry out assignments, including making decisions. Nothing was rarer than for Washington to make an outright decision. He did so. He didn't mind doing so from time to time. He did so in the case of the Little Sarah, that a ship that was taken by the French and turned into a privateer that the Secretary of State didn't want to respond to as Washington wished. And he finally had to order it done. He did so with respect to the proclamation of neutrality. But by and large, Washington avoided making decisions. Even in his first inaugural address, he spoke to Congress in the following terms. He said, "You know what to do. There are many issues on the table for this country. I won't tell you how to resolve them. I only urge you to set about doing it with some expediency." And he tended to govern throughout in that manner, stepping back, entrusting others to decide, and yet never failing to give instruction where it was necessary. Thus, when there was in the first Congress some resistance to the Bill of Rights that had been promised in the course of the ratification campaign for the Constitution, he had to speak up and say, we must give a Bill of Rights. It is no longer an option. It is not an option. But he never took the posture of arguing that it was his plan that had to be adopted or his idea that had to be implemented. He didn't issue commands. What he did was create opportunities for people to govern themselves. Created opportunities for office holders to perform their responsibilities. In some way, he even did this in his command as commanding general. And there is where, of course, it's most difficult, because so much needed to be accomplished in the course of commanding an army in a time of war. But even there still, his approach was of this character. So we may say of Washington's statesmanship that nothing characterized it so much as Washington's self-confidence with regard to what he could accomplish by enlisting others in the task of fulfilling responsibilities, at the same time as pointing them generally in the direction they needed to go. Now, this is George Washington's statesmanship, and that's not the whole of George Washington. And as I told you, we would have some time a little less than I had hoped or planned, but nevertheless some time for conversation about this and any questions you might have. So this is where I should like to break and to invite you to ask questions in particular about the founding, about George Washington, or his relations with others.
Do you think his statesmanship was something that was unique to him because of the place that he held in history, or is that something that could be emulated by others?
Did you all hear the question? I pause because I remain unsure in my mind how far Washington will ever be copied. He may be emulated, and I urge us all to emulate him. But his might have been a level of statesmanship that exceeds so far anything the record of which we know that it would be unrealistic for us ever to contemplate witnessing it again. I don't mean by this to apotheosize George Washington or to raise him beyond the levels of human attainment. But I'm thinking about him now in comparison with the great founders. And let me just illustrate in one particular way. In the ancient world, nothing was more common than for the founder of a significant polity to have to disappear in order for the polity to carry on consistently with the laws that had been developed. And so this was true of Solon, probably Lycurgus, true of Moses, true of many other of the great ancient founders. And in fact, it used to be commonly talked about that their work would never survive if they stayed around because people could appeal to them to release or relax the rigor of their laws. Well, Washington could stay around after he founded. He was able to pull off a founding of magnitude not less than any of those recorded in history, and yet could stay around. So that says to me that his accomplishment exceeds by far what we ordinarily expect. Now, it's also true that Washington had a degree of self-consciousness that it is not easy for any human being to sustain. And what it was that made it possible for him to do so, I do not know. But his focus on the founding, he himself described at the outset of the farewell address in a way that perhaps helps us to understand the answer to your question better than anything, because it still baffles us today. He said, "I have now been at this work for 45 years. The work being the founding of the United States. And anyone who takes the time to count back from 96, 45 years, will come to 1751. 1751, he was 19 years old. The 7 Years' War had not yet begun, though it would shortly after. He did not yet have his colonelcy in the Virginia militia, let alone any of the subsequent responsibilities through the Revolution and the founding." One asks, what did he mean by 45 years, and was he serious? We find that he was serious because he repeats it in a letter in 1798, to Trumbull again, as it were. He refers to that same 45 years. So he claims to have been doing this since he was 19 years old, and finally to have succeeded in 1796. If we take him at his word, we must also conclude that he's done something we never expect to see again.
Thomas Jefferson's Danbury letter concerning separation of church and state, but somehow all this has gotten lost and garbled up. Can you clarify that a little bit? Because I think it was George Washington that said that we couldn't have our country, our government, without a moral basis. something to that effect. I remember there's some statement or quote by him that we couldn't have the government we have without a moral basis. So now we have separation of church and state, which has been taken to hyperbole. And then we have George Washington, who believes in a moral basis for our country. Now maybe, are we to take God out of that? That's what I don't understand. And if you could clarify that.
I think it's clarified by stating that Washington believed in separation of church and state. At the same time, Washington made clear in 1783 that the entire purpose of the Revolution and the founding was to defend civil and religious liberty. And he himself stated that expressly. What he understood by religious liberty, therefore, was precisely the condition necessary for that imitatio Christi. But he could see that that could only flourish in the context of a separation of church and state. After all, we said private morality, self-government, not imposed morality. And that's how he understood it. But that doesn't mean that he read God out of the picture. The fact is, through the imitatio Christi and through the call for self-government, he's reading it in the very form of those citizens who qualify as self-governing citizens. Their self-government attains its completion in their religious adherence. And Washington makes this clear in a long series of letters to congregations all over the United States of every stripe. See, every faith. Because they all, starting with the end of the Revolutionary War, wrote letters of congratulations to him, and he systematically answered every letter he received. And in those letters, he sets forth a well-developed statement of the importance of religion, the importance of religious liberty, and the embracing conditions of American life for religious difference.
Thank you so much.
I was going to ask, you mentioned that Washington kind of...
A little louder, please.
Yeah, okay.
You mentioned how Washington lately, or in our modern era, has kind of been regarded as not as smart as
Right.
the other founders. What kind of education do you have?
What kind of education did Washington have? We can judge it only from the fruits. Extraordinary. We do not know it in terms of the formalities. We know that he had formal schooling only up to about age 9 or so, but that he had tutorial schooling up through his teen years. We've seen, for example, some of his notebooks in mathematics, surveying, and other things. The accomplishments that we witnessed there are really quite extraordinary for a youth of his age. He was obviously able, intellectually able. Most importantly, what we have is an extraordinary record of correspondence. And that record of correspondence contains all forms of quotation from diverse sources, which also demonstrate that he was widely read. Now, the quotations don't have quotation marks around them. And so some casual readers have failed to observe that they were quotations, whether from the Bible or other works. But they are there. He clearly was widely read, and he clearly was able and intelligent. He referred to himself in one letter as a philosophic spectator, by which he meant speculator. And I take him at his word that his abilities extended to the level of philosophic speculation. So we don't know, can't say he went to such and such a school and studied under these eminent divines or professors, but we can say that he shows in his person and in his expression a complete education.
I was wondering if you might be so kind as to further illuminate how and why self-government leads to the imitation of Christ.
Well, I can. Let me say it this way. I'm going to speak from Washington's perspective for the moment. What Washington was describing was what happens to people who act consistently for the sake of justice in their dealings with others. And this, he says, is the imitatio Christi. As self-government, which requires the moderating influence of virtue in the soul, induces the desire to attain justice consistently. This is why Aristotle calls it the justice, the complete virtue, the comprehensive virtue. So if a genuinely self-governing soul is a virtuous soul, and that virtue is complete in that soul will pursue justice, will act justly. The consistent pursuit of justice is the imitatio Christi. In the 1783 letter, we see that the closing appeal is to the imitatio Christi, but prior to that is mainly an excursus on justice. Justice in our dealings with the army, now being discharged, and what's owed to them, and also justice among ourselves, in arriving at those political arrangements that will facilitate Republican government. So that these are the things which eventuate in the imitatio Christi in the 1783 letter. That's what I think George Washington means by that.
I'd like to just piggyback on that question. So imitatio Christi, what does that actually mean here? Because it sounds like, everything you've said so far sounds like natural justice. It sounds like the kind of justice that anyone might be capable of. So is there something distinctively or uniquely Christian about the kind of morals that Washington wants to inculcate that could not be understood or grasped or lived out by a non-Christian?
I think anyone can live the life of the imitatio Christi. And I think Washington thought so. And that's why he didn't say by become Christian. He simply said, let us imitate Christ. So I don't think that his invitation at that point is exclusive or sectarian, if I may put it in those terms. Now, therefore, your more direct question is, can anyone live the life imitatio Christi without professing Christianity? I have to imagine that that is possible for several reasons, not the least of which is because the holy canons testify that it is so.
Did he imitate Christ more or less as Benjamin Franklin imitated Christ?
Professor Bush. As Benjamin Franklin imitated Christ, the question would be whether he ever understood himself to do so. You know, when Franklin discusses the choice of Hercules, he, interestingly enough, does not find occasion to relate it to the imitation of Christ. He treats it as sui generis, which I take to mean, therefore, that for Franklin, there are several choices with respect to the practicalities of life, which he might have called the virtues of life, that one can make, that one is under an obligation to pursue the virtues, but one pursues them because they're instrumental to certain levels of peace in society, and therefore one's welfare. I don't believe that Franklin ever counseled pursuing them for themselves. If that's the case, then it would not have been an imitatio Christi.
I think we have time for about one more question.
Okay.
Washington mentions that America being either the example of like a light investment without some democracy. So with the current elections in Iraq, will Washington agree with America's position of spreading democracy to the military?
Would Washington agree with spreading democracy through militarism?
Yeah.
Well, I think you would have to separate those things if you were listening to George Washington. The means are always guided in any particular circumstance by what conforms to the needs of the polity, not to external demands. And so if the United States found itself in any situation where to act justly required using its military, Washington would say that's approvable. If acting justly did not call upon the military, or specifically counseled against it, then he would recommend not using the military. That's how he would make that decision, because the requirement is to act with justice for our sakes. Now, with respect to influencing or benefiting others, other nations or peoples, not our own, it seems to me so long as it's not a question of permanent friendships or permanent enmities, Washington would consider that a matter of policy. So in some circumstances it would be appropriate, in others not. It's always to be determined in the circumstances, a matter of policy.